Religion. For billions of people, it's the answer to life's biggest questions. But when you look at the world stage, it is the question. It's this incredible power that can ignite holy wars that burn for generations. But it can also be the one thing, the only thing, that brings bitter enemies to the peace table. So how can one of humanity's greatest sources of hope also become one of its most dangerous weapons? Well, let's get into it.
This is what happens when faith is wielded as a weapon. For centuries, religion has been tangled up in some of history's most devastating conflicts. And this image from Myanmar, it's a really stark, modern reminder of how quickly spiritual devotion can be twisted into a justification for violence. It leaves not just buildings, but entire communities in ashes.
But then, on the flip side, you have this. This is President Jimmy Carter, and he's talking about one of the 20th century's greatest diplomatic achievements, the Camp David Accords. He's making it crystal clear that if he hadn't understood the deep religious beliefs of both the Egyptian and Israeli leaders, peace would have been totally impossible. See, what Carter got is the central lesson here. In the high-stakes game of global politics, ignoring faith isn't just a mistake. It's pretty much a recipe for failure.
And for a long time, statecraft tried to do exactly that, just ignore it. Diplomats often treated religion like it was this private, personal thing, completely separate from the real issues of economics and military might. But that approach left this massive blind spot, what one scholar called the missing dimension of statecraft. And understanding that missing dimension is more critical right now than it has ever been. So, how does this powerful force get turned into a weapon in the first place? Well, it usually starts by fusing faith with national identity, which forges the first edge of our double-edged sword.
The key idea we're talking about here is religious nationalism. Now, this isn't just about a country having a majority religion. No, this is a political project where the state actively favors one religious group, basically defining the true nation in religious terms. And what that does is it automatically creates an us versus them dynamic, those who fit the mold and those who don't.
And listen, this is not some fringe idea. It's a huge force in global politics today. In Russia, you've got the Orthodox Church declaring the war in Ukraine a holy war to defend a spiritual Russian world. In India, the Hindutva movement is pushing to redefine the secular state as a Hindu nation. And right in the United States, Christian nationalism promotes the idea of a uniquely Christian nation, and that influences everything from domestic policy to foreign affairs. So when a nation's identity gets wrapped up in a single faith, it doesn't just unite, it also divides. And that division, that's where things can get violent.
So once that national identity is tied to a single faith, it creates a fault line. And it's right there that the sword turns from a symbol of who we are into an instrument of division.
Now, here's a really crucial distinction that we often miss. We tend to think of religious conflict as one faith against another. That's called interreligious conflict. But some of history's absolute bloodiest and most intractable conflicts are intra-religious. These are brutal civil wars fought within the same faith.
So, if we look at interreligious conflict, you can see these flashpoints all across South and Southeast Asia. Tensions between Buddhist majorities and Muslim minorities are, unfortunately, nothing new. They're often fanned into flame by nationalist monks who stoke fears by bringing up historical grievances, like the destruction of the ancient Buddhist center of Nalanda almost 1,000 years ago. They use this past to frame modern Muslims as an existential threat today.
But for a really powerful example of intra-religious conflict, we have to go back 14 centuries, all the way to the death of the Prophet Muhammad. The entire split between Sunni and Shia Islam boils down to one question: who should lead the faith next? The Sunnis believed it should be a chosen, trusted companion, but the Shia believed leadership had to pass through the Prophet's bloodline, starting with his cousin Ali.
Now, this was not a 50-50 split, not even close. Today, about 85% of the world's Muslims are Sunni. So right away, this created a global majority-minority dynamic that started with a succession dispute 1,400 years ago, but it continues to define power and politics right now.
And that brings us right to the present day. That 1,400-year-old theological disagreement is now a major geopolitical fault line. It's being exploited to fuel a devastating proxy war across the Middle East, with Sunni-led Saudi Arabia and Shia-led Iran battling for regional dominance. The battlefields? They're in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen.
It's a pretty bleak picture, I know, but remember, that's only one edge of the sword. So let's turn now to the other side, how faith, when it's in the right hands, can become this incredible, unmatched tool for making peace.
It's called faith-based diplomacy, and it works on a completely different level than traditional politics. As former Congressman Lee Hamilton put it so well,
It goes beyond just material or political interests. It speaks to the heart, mind, and spirit of the combatants. And that provides this transcendent power that can work where everything else has failed. You want proof? Look at how modern Europe was created. After World War II, France and Germany were just filled with hatred for one another. But this faith-based movement called moral rearmaments started bringing thousands of them together, not to talk politics, but to build personal connections, to build reconciliation. And it was at one of these conferences that the leaders of France and Germany actually met, they formed a bond, and together they laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union. It's one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of our time, and it was rooted in faith-based reconciliation.
And this isn't just something from the history books. Think about the challenge of reforming Pakistani madrasas, some with ties to terrorism. A faith-based diplomatic effort didn't just barge in with a list of demands. No, it used empathy. An American Christian who was leading the project opened a meeting with hostile clerics by quoting from the Quran. Then he invoked Jesus, who is a revered prophet in Islam, and asked, how would he want us to interact? And over the course of an hour, rage turned to fellowship. It's just a powerful example of using shared transcendent values to break down the logic of extremism.
All right, so where does all of this leave us? We've seen the two faces of religion in global affairs, the sword that divides and the hand that can bring peace. And this is really the ultimate takeaway. Religion is a power that is just too potent to ignore and way too complex to simplify. It can absolutely amplify conflict by creating an us versus them mindset that's incredibly hard to break. But that very same power, its appeal to the heart, to shared values, to something higher than politics, is also the thing that can provide the key to unlocking peace. The ancient strategist Sun Tzu said that the greatest victory is the one you win without ever having to fight. And in a way, that's exactly the promise of faith-based diplomacy. It's the art of achieving peace by appealing to our deepest convictions, which makes it an absolutely crucial part of modern smart power.
So the final question isn't whether religion will play a role in our future. It will. Of course it will. The real question is how we choose to engage with it. In a world where religious identity is becoming more, not less important, the challenge for all of us is to figure out how to harness its capacity for reconciliation, to make sure that this powerful, double-edged sword is ultimately used to build bridges, not walls.